Of all the names that echo across the golden age of piracy, few have the strange charm of Calico Jack Rackham. He wasn't the fiercest pirate. He wasn't the richest. He didn't command fleets of ships like Bartholomew Roberts, nor did he spread terror like Blackbeard. And yet, his name survives, etched into history not through fear, but through style, rebellion, and the company he kept. Calico Jack's legend rests on three things: his flamboyant sense of dress, his invention of one of the most famous pirate flags in history, and his partnership with two of the most notorious women ever to sail under the black flag, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. But to sail with Calico Jack wasn't to serve under a ruthless tyrant like Charles Vane, nor to follow a calculating commander like Roberts. Life under Rackham was something else entirely. His leadership was charismatic but flawed, his ambition grand but rarely matched by success. His men followed him not because they feared him, but because they liked him, or at least they liked his style. Imagine Nassau in the 1710s. The taverns are alive with music, dice clattering on tables, rum spilling across the floor. And there in the centre, dressed not in drab rags but in bright calico cloth, is Jack Rackham, laughing, charming, boasting of his next adventure. Where Charles Vane ruled with cruelty, Rackham won men over with wit. Where other captains kept discipline, Rackham let chaos swirl. To sail with Calico was to join a crew where freedom was valued more than order, and where every raid was an excuse to celebrate. But charm alone doesn't win battles. Rackham's career was filled with daring raids, yes, but also with failure, capture, and a spectacular fall. His story is not one of vast treasure or naval victories, but of defiance, flamboyance, and doomed romance. He was, in many ways, a pirate who embodied the spirit of rebellion more than the reality of success. And yet, perhaps that's why his name endures. The skull and crossed swords flag he designed has become one of the most iconic symbols of piracy. His partnership with Anne Bonny and Mary Read remains one of the most remarkable tales in maritime history. And his life, short though it was, has inspired centuries of stories. Tonight, we'll step aboard the ship of Calico Jack Rackham. We'll see what it was like to follow him, to live under his carefree but reckless command, to sail with Anne and Mary at your side, and to witness the final downfall of a pirate whose style outshone his substance. This isn't the story of the most successful pirate. It's the story of the most stylish, the most flamboyant, the man who dressed like a peacock and died like a rebel. This is the tale of Calico Jack Rackham. John Rackham, the man who would one day be remembered as Calico Jack, was born around 1682. Little is known of his early life, but by the time his name began appearing in the records of the Caribbean, he was already a pirate, or at least a pirate in the making. Unlike Blackbeard or Roberts, who carefully honed reputations as formidable leaders, Rackham built his identity around personality, charm, and style. And style, for Rackham, meant calico. In an age when most sailors wore whatever rags they could patch together, Rackham stood out for his brightly patterned shirts made from calico cloth. Bold colors, exotic prints. These garments were imported from India and expensive by pirate standards. They announced him before he ever spoke. Where Charles Vane was terrifying and Blackbeard was theatrical, Rackham was flamboyant, the kind of man who wanted to be noticed, even in the crowded taverns of Nassau. Rackham first appears in pirate history as the quartermaster under Charles Vane. The quartermaster was second only to the captain, tasked with keeping discipline, dividing plunder, and serving as the voice of the crew. It was a powerful role, and it gave Rackham the chance to prove his leadership. But Vane and Rackham were very different men. Where Vane ruled with cruelty and fear, Rackham was more relaxed, easygoing, and charismatic. While Vane's temper kept his men in line, Rackham's humour and wit earned him their loyalty. The breaking point came in 1719, when Vane refused to fight a French warship, choosing instead to retreat. His crew, furious at what they saw as cowardice, voted to depose him. In his place, they chose Rackham. The flamboyant quartermaster became captain overnight, rising not through terror, but through popularity. He was now the master of his own ship, with the loyalty of his men and the opportunity to carve his name into history. Rackham's early command reflected his personality. He wasn't reckless like Vane, nor calculating like Roberts. Instead, he was opportunistic. He led raids on small merchant vessels, striking quickly and vanishing before larger ships could catch him. His style of piracy was less about amassing great fortunes and more about keeping his crew fed, supplied, and entertained. The plunder was modest, but the rum flowed freely, and the celebrations were legendary. But what truly set Rackham apart was his symbolism. He designed one of the most recognizable pirate flags in history, a skull with two crossed swords. Unlike the traditional Jolly Roger with its crossed bones, Rackham's flag was more aggressive, more stylish, more him. It announced to the world not just that pirates were coming, but that Calico Jack was coming. To sail under that flag was to belong to something memorable, something iconic. Rackham's charm also extended beyond his crew. In Nassau, he was a fixture in taverns and brothels, laughing, drinking, and spinning tales. He was no tyrant captain, but rather a companion, someone who blurred the line between leader and comrade. His men respected him not because they feared him, but because they liked him. That bond made life under Rackham more appealing than under harsher captains, even if it also meant a lack of discipline that sometimes cost them dearly. Of course, popularity and flamboyance only went so far in the brutal world of piracy. Rackham's raids were small, his prizes modest, and his reputation less feared than others. But he had one advantage few pirates could claim: Anne Bonny. Their meeting in Nassau would change both their lives. Anne, the fiery Irishwoman who had defied her husband and lived openly among pirates, was drawn to Rackham's charm and colour. He, in turn, was captivated by her spirit. Their affair scandalized the pirate haven, and when Anne's husband sought to expose her, Rackham offered her a place at his side, on land and at sea. Together, they would become one of piracy's most famous couples, a partnership as notorious as it was doomed. But that chapter lay just ahead. For now, Calico Jack was rising, carving out his identity not through fear or fortune, but through style, wit, and companionship. He had won command from Charles Vane, flown his own flag, and built a crew that followed him by choice rather than coercion. It was a shaky foundation for a pirate's career, but it was unmistakably his own. And as the seas of the Caribbean grew darker, Rackham's flamboyance would only shine brighter, until, inevitably, it brought him to ruin. To sail with Jack Rackham was unlike serving under most other pirate captains. If Blackbeard's ship was a floating theatre of terror, and Charles Vane's deck was a place of fear and punishment, then Rackham's vessel was something else entirely, part pirate ship, part carnival, and part tavern on the waves. Life under Rackham reflected the man himself, colourful, loose, and sometimes reckless. His ship was no grand galleon or heavily armed warship, but a nimble sloop, ideal for quick raids on small merchant vessels. It wasn't built for large-scale battles, but it was perfect for hit-and-run piracy, slipping in and out of shipping lanes before the authorities could respond. For his crew, this meant fewer massive hauls, but also fewer crushing defeats. Rackham avoided picking fights with ships that could overpower him. Instead, he targeted smaller, softer prizes, merchant sloops laden with rum, sugar, or supplies. The work was dangerous, yes, but compared to the reckless charges of Vane or the endless grind under Roberts, life with Rackham felt almost casual. But it was in the atmosphere aboard his ship that Rackham stood out. His men described him as easygoing and charismatic, more inclined to laugh with his crew than berate them. Discipline was loose, Rum was plentiful. Dice and cards made their rounds on deck. The boundaries between captain and crew blurred, with Rackham often drinking and joking among his men. It gave the impression of equality, a shared brotherhood. That looseness had its benefits. Sailors who grew weary of harsh captains sometimes gravitated to Rackham's banner. He offered a life with less brutality, more freedom, and a sense of belonging. His calico shirts and flamboyant style weren't just personal quirks. They symbolized a rejection of the drab, rigid hierarchies that most sailors despised. Rackham embodied a kind of freedom that drew men to him, even if it made his command less efficient. But the looseness had its dangers too. Without strict order, discipline often frayed. Some raids were poorly planned, others botched entirely. Victories were celebrated with days of drunkenness, leaving the crew vulnerable. And while Rackham could inspire loyalty with charm, he lacked the ruthless decisiveness of more feared captains. Still, there was something magnetic about him. He wasn't a towering figure like Blackbeard, nor a calculating tactician like Roberts. Instead, he made his crew feel like they were part of something fun, something different. To sail under Rackham was to live with constant excitement, one day drinking in Nassau, the next chasing down a fat merchant ship, the next hiding from the navy in a deserted cove. And then, of course, there was Anne Bonny. Life under Rackham's command changed dramatically once she joined the crew. Anne wasn't a woman content to stay ashore while the men played pirate. She fought, drank, and cursed as fiercely as any man, earning the respect of Rackham's sailors. To have her aboard gave the ship a sense of uniqueness, a wild energy unlike any other crew. And when Mary Read later disguised herself as a man and joined them, Rackham's ship became infamous, not just for its flamboyant captain, but for the two deadly women who fought at his side. On deck, daily life was a blend of hardship and revelry. Sailors mended sails and scrubbed decks, loaded cannons and stood watch. But when the work was done, the ship often transformed into a floating tavern. Fiddles played, dice clattered, mugs clinked. Rackham was always at the center of it, smiling in his bright calico shirt, a cup of rum in hand, cracking jokes with the men who adored him. But beneath the laughter, danger always lurked. Rackham's easygoing nature sometimes made him underestimate the risks. His small prizes rarely built lasting wealth. His crew, though loyal, lacked the discipline of hardened fleets. And though his ship was nimble, it could never stand toe-to-toe with the larger warships patrolling the Caribbean. Yet for the men who served with him, none of that mattered. They weren't chasing vast fortunes or empire-shaking victories. They were chasing freedom, rum, and the thrill of living outside the law. Under Rackham, they found it. To sail with Calico Jack was to live like a spark in the dark, brief, bright, and unforgettable. If Jack Rackham had sailed alone, history might have remembered him as a colorful but minor pirate. His raids were modest, his victories limited, and his flamboyant style more memorable than his plunder. But fate placed two extraordinary women on his deck, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and with them, Rackham's story became legend. Anne Bonny was already infamous in Nassau before she ever joined Rackham. Born in Ireland around 1697, she was the daughter of a lawyer and his servant. She grew up strong-willed and fiery, defying every expectation placed on her. By the time she reached the Caribbean, she had married a small-time sailor, James Bonny, but she found no satisfaction in the life of a respectable wife. Instead, Anne was drawn to the pirates of Nassau, their lawlessness, their freedom, their refusal to bow to kings or husbands. It was there, in the raucous taverns of Nassau, that she met John Calico Jack Rackham. He was charming, flamboyant, and full of life. Everything her husband was not. Their affair scandalized the settlement, and when James Bonny tried to expose her, she chose Rackham without hesitation. When Rackham offered her a place aboard his ship, she didn't shy away. She disguised herself as a man, joined the crew, and quickly proved she was every bit as fierce as her shipmates. Life with Anne aboard was electric. She wasn't a mascot or a token, she was a fighter. Armed with pistols and cutlasses, she stood shoulder to shoulder with the men during raids. Sailors who mocked her quickly learned the cost of underestimating her temper. For Rackham's crew, Anne's presence added a fiery spark, and for Rackham himself, it made his ship feel alive with rebellion and romance. But Anne was not the only woman to join Rackham's crew. Around 1720, another figure emerged, Mary Read. Mary had lived a life of disguise from the start, dressing as a boy in her youth to gain opportunities denied to women. She had served in the British Army, married, and then, after her husband's death, returned to sea disguised once more as a man. By the time she crossed paths with Rackham, she was already seasoned in combat, fearless and hardened by hardship. Mary joined the crew under the guise of a young sailor, but Anne soon discovered her secret. The two became close friends, perhaps even more. And when Mary's identity was revealed, the crew accepted her without hesitation. After all, she fought with more ferocity than most men. Together, Anne and Mary gave Rackham's crew an energy unlike any other. In battle, they fought on the front lines, pistols blazing, blades flashing. They cursed, drank, and brawled with the men, earning respect through sheer grit. For the sailors of the Caribbean, the sight of two women fighting as pirates was shocking, unforgettable, and terrifying. Stories spread quickly, adding to Rackham's reputation, not for his victories, but for his crew's audacity. Life aboard with Anne and Mary was rowdy, dangerous, and intoxicating. Their presence emboldened the crew, turning every raid into something larger than life. For Rackham, their loyalty was priceless. Anne was his lover and partner, Mary his comrade and ally. Together, the three formed the heart of a pirate crew that cared less about wealth than about freedom, thrill, and defiance. And yet, for all their fire, the same weaknesses remained. Rackham's raids were small, his targets modest, and his caution often outweighed by his crew's reckless energy. Anne and Mary gave him fame, but they couldn't give him fortune. Still, when history remembers Calico Jack Rackham, it is not his victories or his treasure that stand out. It is this: the flamboyant captain who sailed with two women as fierce as any pirate who ever lived. In a world that expected women to stay ashore, Anne Bonny and Mary Read carved their names into the sea, and Calico Jack rode the wave of their legend. By 1719 and 1720, the seas of the Caribbean were alive with whispers of a strange pirate crew. It wasn't their wealth that made them famous, nor the scale of their victories. It was their audacity, the flamboyant captain in bright calico, and the two women who fought alongside his men. Wherever Calico Jack Rackham sailed, stories followed, and in the world of piracy, stories were often as valuable as gold. Rackham's ship, usually a small, fast sloop, prowled the shipping lanes between Jamaica and the Bahamas. He avoided heavily armed vessels, preferring to strike quick and vanish into the blue horizon. His targets were modest, small merchant sloops, fishing boats, or lightly guarded traders. The plunder was rarely spectacular: barrels of rum, sacks of sugar, bolts of cloth, and the occasional chest of coin. But it kept his crew supplied and his legend alive. For the merchants and colonists of the Caribbean, however, these raids were infuriating. A single lost cargo could cripple a small trader, and Rackham's unpredictability made him a constant nuisance. Colonists reported his attacks with growing alarm, describing not only his daring, but the presence of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who fought fiercely in men's clothing, cursing and firing pistols with shocking ferocity. For the colonial authorities, this was more than piracy. It was scandal. Women at sea, dressed as men, defying every expectation of gender and propriety, were as shocking as the raids themselves. Rackham's reputation grew not because he commanded great fleets or won epic battles, but because he represented rebellion in its purest form. His flag, the skull with crossed swords, became a symbol of his defiance. It was different from the bones and hourglasses of other pirates. Sleeker, sharper, more stylish, it was a statement as much as a warning. When it rose against the horizon, sailors knew they faced not just pirates but Calico Jack. Life aboard remained lively, if precarious. Rackham's leadership style meant that discipline was loose, celebrations frequent, and risks often underestimated. Victories were followed by wild nights of drinking, music, and dancing on deck. The ship was as much a floating party as it was a vessel of war. To his men, this was part of the appeal. To outsiders, it looked like recklessness. Still, there were moments of genuine danger. Colonial patrol ships hunted Rackham's crew relentlessly. More than once, they were forced to abandon prizes and flee into hidden coves or shallow waters where larger ships could not follow. Anne and Mary's presence gave the crew courage in these moments, their ferocity in battle rallying the men when hope seemed dim. Eyewitnesses later recalled that when most of Rackham's crew wavered, it was the women who fought hardest, pistols blazing, voices carrying across the deck with curses that would make hardened sailors blush. And yet, for all their boldness, Rackham's raids never elevated him to the heights of piracy's great captains. He lacked the cunning of Roberts, the intimidation of Blackbeard, or even the ruthless drive of Vane. His reputation was built not on fortune, but on spectacle. For some, that was enough. For others, it marked him as a pirate who burned brightly but shallowly, a man destined for legend, but not for lasting power. Still, the colonies seethed under his nuisance raids, and the governors were determined to end his career. Warrants were issued, patrols doubled, and rewards offered for his capture. Rackham's flamboyant reign had drawn too much attention, and the jaws of the empire were closing around him. But for the moment, he sailed on, his sloop darting through the Caribbean, his crew laughing, drinking, and fighting under a flag that promised defiance above all. By late 1720, the flamboyant days of Calico Jack Rackham's piratical revelry were drawing to a close. His raids, modest though they were, had stirred up too much anger among the Jamaican authorities. Colonial governors had tolerated pirates in earlier years when they could be useful against rival empires, but those days were over. Now, piracy was a stain to be scrubbed clean. Rackham, with his small sloop and scandalous crew, became a target too enticing to ignore. The man chosen to hunt him down was Captain Jonathan Barnet, a former privateer who knew the waters of the Caribbean well. Barnet was tasked with tracking Rackham's ship, the Revenge, and putting an end to its nuisance once and for all. With orders in hand and the backing of Jamaican authorities, Barnet set out into the waters around Negril, where Rackham was last reported prowling. Rackham, meanwhile, was anchored off the coast, his crew enjoying one of their all-too-frequent celebrations. They had captured a small fishing boat earlier that week, little more than a few barrels of supplies, but for Rackham's men, any excuse was enough to drink and carouse. The night was thick with rum, laughter, and music, the ship swaying gently under the stars. On deck, some crewmen slumped in drunken stupors, while others sang bawdy songs. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, as always, kept pace with the men, drinking and laughing, though both remained sharper than most of their companions. It was in this state of revelry that Barnet's ship found them. Under cover of night, Barnet approached, his sails trimmed, his cannons ready. By the time Rackham's crew spotted the looming silhouette, it was too late. Barnet hailed them, demanding their surrender in the king's name. Panic erupted on the Revenge. Most of Rackham's crew were too drunk to fight. They stumbled, fell, or hid below decks. A few managed to fumble for pistols and cutlasses, but their resistance was pitiful compared to the disciplined volleys from Barnet's men. In the chaos, only two figures stood firm: Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Eyewitnesses would later swear that the two women fought like demons. Pistols in both hands, cutlasses flashing, they cursed and roared at the enemy. Mary Read, furious at the cowardice of her shipmates, reportedly fired her pistol into the hold, shouting that if the men would not fight, they deserved to die like dogs. Anne, equally fierce, slashed at boarders, spitting insults with every blow. Rackham himself? His reputation did not shine that night. Accounts suggest that he surrendered quickly once it was clear the fight was hopeless. While Anne and Mary fought to the last, Rackham was taken without glory, bound and hauled aboard Barnet's vessel. His flamboyant calico shirt, once a mark of defiance, now made him an easy figure to mock as he sat in chains. By dawn, it was over. Barnet had his prize. The notorious Calico Jack Rackham, along with Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the remnants of his crew, were prisoners. The sea that had once been their playground had betrayed them at last. The capture marked the end of Rackham's career and the final act of his legend. His flamboyance had carried him far, but in the end, it could not save him from discipline, order, and the steady hand of a determined hunter. But his story was not yet finished. The real drama was still to come, in the courtrooms of Jamaica, where Rackham, Anne, and Mary would face judgment, and where their names would be etched forever into pirate lore. When the captured crew of the Revenge arrived in Spanish town Jamaica in November 1720, the spectacle was irresistible. A flamboyant pirate captain in calico, 2 women disguised as men who had fought like demons, and a band of drunken sailors. This was not just another pirate trial. It was theatre. Rackham, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the others were locked in the dank cells of the Jamaican prison while colonial officials prepared the proceedings. For years, governors had sought to stamp out piracy, and now they had the perfect chance to make an example. The trial was swift. Witnesses testified to Rackham's raids on fishing boats and small traders. The evidence was clear. He had plundered under the black flag. Rackham offered little defense. He sat sullen, his charm dulled, the bright calico shirt that had once made him stand out now a pathetic reminder of past swagger. His crew, many of them ashamed or broken, followed him into condemnation. The sentence was death. Rackham and his men were to be hanged by the neck until dead, their bodies displayed as a warning to others who dared to defy the crown. But it was Anne Bonny and Mary Read who stole the spotlight. When they were called to trial, their true identities as women were revealed, shocking the courtroom. The colony gossiped furiously. 2 women, dressed as men, had fought alongside pirates with unmatched ferocity. Their names were whispered with equal measures of scandal and awe. Both women claimed they were pregnant, a defense that spared them from immediate execution. The court, bound by law, granted them temporary reprieve. Mary Read would later die in prison of fever, but Anne Bonny's fate is more mysterious. Some say she was quietly released thanks to her influential father. Others insist she lived a long life in obscurity, her days as a pirate fading into rumor. Calico Jack, however, had no such escape. On November 18, 1720, he was led to the gallows. The people of Spanish Town gathered eagerly, hungry to see the man whose antics had scandalized the Caribbean. Rackham walked to the scaffold in silence, the noose swaying in the humid breeze. Before his death, Anne Bonny was allowed to see him one last time. According to legend, her words cut sharper than any blade. "If you had fought like a man, you would not now be hanged like a dog." It was a brutal epitaph for a man who had built his legend on style rather than strength. Moments later, the trap was sprung, and John Calico Jack Rackham's body dangled lifeless. His flamboyant life ended not in glory, but in disgrace. His corpse was taken to a small quay off the coast of Jamaica, where it was displayed in an iron cage, gibbeted, as a warning to all sailors. There, exposed to sun, wind, and sea, the man who once pranced in calico became a grim skeleton of piracy's downfall. And yet, Rackham's legacy endured. His raids may have been modest, his victories few, but his flag, the skull with crossed swords, became one of the most iconic symbols of piracy. His partnership with Anne Bonny and Mary Read turned him into a legend larger than life. In the end, Rackham's story was not one of wealth or power. It was the story of defiance, of style, of a man who made himself unforgettable, not through fear, but through audacity. To sail with Calico Jack was to sail with laughter, with colour, with danger, and inevitably with doom. And so ended the life of Calico Jack Rackham, a pirate remembered not for great victories or vast treasure, but for the colour and style with which he lived. His calico shirts, his iconic flag, his charm and flamboyance, all of it carved him a place in history. Yet when his moment of truth arrived, it wasn't Jack who left the deepest mark. It was the two women who stood at his side. Rackham's legacy is tied inseparably to Anne Bonny and Mary Read. In the heat of battle, when his drunken crew faltered, it was Anne and Mary who fought like lions. While Rackham surrendered, they stood defiant. And though he met his end at the gallows, their stories carried on, fiery, scandalous, unforgettable. What does Calico Jack's tale teach us? That style can win loyalty, but it cannot win battles. That charm can light a fire, but it cannot shield you from the hangman's rope. And yet, his name still survives, not as a conqueror, but as the pirate who sailed with two of the fiercest women the seas had ever seen. Now I want to hear from you. Would you have joined Calico Jack's crew for the freedom and laughter, or would you have preferred the stricter, more disciplined command of someone like Bartholomew Roberts? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'll be reading them all. But don't set sail just yet, because if you thought Calico Jack's story was wild, wait until you hear what came next. Our next voyage will follow the lives of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who defied society, dressed as men, fought as pirates, and became legends in their own right. Their tale is one of rebellion, fury, and survival, and it may just be the most unforgettable chapter in the golden age of piracy. So join me next time as we uncover what it was really like to sail with Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Until then, may your seas be calm, your horizons wide, and your nights filled with tales of the Black Flag.